Hello everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. I'm here, one of my writers, in this case Danny. Thank you so much, Danny. A script, a Canadian conspiracy, the Black Donnellys Massacre. Never heard of this? The format of the show, if you're new here, we're going to read this together and explore. Let's jump in, shall we? The frilly curtains tend to start twitching whenever a new family member moves into the neighborhood. I'll admit that I've done it myself in the past. I'm usually just looking out for a few very specific pointers. I'll take it as a good sign if the new residents have got pets or are talking in calm voices or are so very old and close to death that are unlikely to have the energy to cause much trouble before the next lot inevitably move into the house in the very near future. Do really old people who are close to death move house? Is that something they do? My grandparents lived in the same house for a very long time before their inevitable deaths. And because they're really old, moving house would be like a big effort for them. And they know people in the neighborhood. What are they going to do? Go out and make friends with the other 90-year-olds? Doesn't seem very realistic to me. I'll take it as a bad sign if the new neighbours are wearing Prince Andrew face masks and fall out of the removal van covered in blood and vomit as their 8 screaming children run around the driveway with heroin needles sticking out of their arms whilst chanting the theme tune to Peppa Pig. I have that absolutely nailed into my head because my kids are not in a Peppa Pig phase at the moment, but they definitely were. And it's just it haunts the minds of parents. Just before we continue with today's video, I want to say that it's brought to you by Keeps. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, Simon, you are a bald man. But that doesn't mean that I can't help look out for my fellow follically challenged friends. Keeps is all about keeping your hair where it belongs. Unless it's too late for someone like me. With Keeps, you can kiss those awkward doctor's office visits goodbye, say hello to professional care from the comfort of your own home, just hop online, complete a consultation, and boom! You're matched with a personalized treatment plan delivered discreetly to your door, and the best part, you can adjust, pause, or cancel your plan anytime. Keeps offers treatments that are clinically proven to work, whether you're preventing hair loss, stimulating growth, or just taking better care of what you've got. And check this out. The products aren't run-of-the-mill shampoos and conditioners. They're specifically formulated to complement your treatment plan and make thinning hair look thicker. Keeps is loved and trusted by over 1 million men just like you. With thousands of 5-star reviews, you know you're in good hands. Plus, they've got your back with 24/7 support and discreet packaging, so no one has to know your secrets. So whether you're fighting hair loss or just want to keep your mane in tip-top shape, Keeps have got you covered. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video, and for a special offer, go to keeps.com/Simon or click the link in the description below. That's keeps.com/Simon. That's me. Let's keep those heads nice and hairy, shall we, gents? And now back to today's video. There are far too many other frilly curtains witches who really only care about whether the new neighbours might be pesky foreigners. Although in the north of England, the term foreigner might sometimes be employed to describe someone from a different continent, a different country, a different town, or from the next street up where the rough kids set fire to dead cats that they found in wheelie bins. Jesus Christ. That's what the north of England's like, apparently. Just dead cats in wheelie bins everywhere, just being set fire to. It's like it must be a tradition up there. Danny's from the north. I've never been. No, I have been. Of course, I've been to the north of England. I found so many dead cats. The Donnelly family might not necessarily have been expecting an easy ride when they upped sticks from their native Ireland and moved all the way to Canada in the 1840s. Oh, so I'm imagining all of this is very present day because, wheelie bins and it's like, oh, now we're going back to 1840s because that's where today's story's happening rather than Danny's street. And to put it mildly, they quickly rubbed up some of their neighbours in the wrong way. But this was no minor neighbourly squabble over borrowed lawnmowers or overgrown hedges or nymphomaniac grandparents. Danny, no. No. The ever-growing Donnelly family found themselves locked in a wild feud, which evolved into 4 decades of bitter business rivalry, violence, robberies, sabotage, slit throats, murder, and at least one instance of swearing at a constable. It was a feud that led to a genuinely gruesome final showdown in 1880, which went down in history as the Black Donnellys Massacre, during which no less than 5 members of the family were savagely murdered in one night. Oh my god. There must have been really bad neighbours that you had to murder them. But were the Donnellys the villainous architects of their own downfall, or were they innocent victims of a local lynch mob who didn't care too much for outsiders? Can it be true that nobody was ever convicted in the murders despite everyone in town knowing exactly who was responsible? And why was the story suppressed for well over 70 years, with some locals still regarding the matter as an unspeakable topic even today? Well, if they got away with it, it's because they'll be like, never mention the murders that no one ever seemed to follow up on. Never mention them. They will be forgotten and we'll all live out our lives. That's why no one would ever mention it. It's not like if you'd murdered someone in the past, you're just walking around being like, hey, Bob, remember that time we all got together and murdered that entire family? No one's doing that. That would be crazy. Hop down the road to my place where we can discuss the matter in even more detail while cracking open a neighbourly bottle of wine and munching on a few light nibbles. But take your shoes off before you come in and bring back that cement mixer I lent you 6 months ago. Where's the cement mixer? Why would you have a cement mixer? You're mixing your own... I guess people do mix their own cement. I remember mixing my own cement. I think my dad repaired our driveway or something. But we didn't have a cement mixer. It was only a little bit of cement, so we just mixed it up in a bucket or something. Yeah, I remember that. If you got your own cement mixer, you're up to some serious... Meet the Blackfeet. During their long residence in Canada, the family were nicknamed the Black Donnellys, which is a bit of an odd nickname of a family of white Irish Catholics. It's like, could you think of more white people than Irish Catholics? It's been suggested that the name refers to the blackness of their moods and their hearts, but it may have been a name plucked from centuries of good old religious conflict. You could just also call it racism, right? They're like these outsiders from Ireland and they arrive in Canada and they're just like, it just feels a little bit racist, doesn't it? And by a little bit, I just mean just regular racist. When a young James Donnelly, known as Jim, and his wife Joanna Donnelly, known as Judith, packed up their troubles and moved to Canada in the 1840s, they were following the lead of a great many other Roman Catholic Irish immigrants who were escaping religious and political turmoil, not to mention the small matter of the Great Famine, to seek out fresh opportunities in this new Canadian world of maple syrup and quite staggering politeness. The religious troubles had been bubbling away in Ireland since way back in the 17th century, when the power and wealth effectively shifted to a minority landholding Protestants, much to the detriment of the Catholic majority, who lost many of their rights and were forced into hardship and poverty and death by the actions of the ever-escalating rents demanded by the filthy rich Protestant landlords. This led, in the 1750s, to the rise of a secret society called the White Boys, formed by angry Catholics who sought harsh revenge on all Protestants and even other Catholics who dared to engage or do business with any everyday Protestants. The White Boys got their name from the white smocks they wore while conducting their campaigns of terror against the Protestants and sympathetic Catholics, campaigns which often involved killing livestock and burning homes to the ground. Oh my god. But white, why would you choose white? It's going to be a nightmare to get all the blood off. In contrast, the term Blackfeet was a derogatory name thrown at any Catholic who dared to associate with Protestants, or the English for that matter. Although they would never have referred to themselves in such a way, Jim and Judith Donnelly were two such Blackfeet who chose to try and get along with their neighbours instead of attempting to set fire to everything. You'd think that this healthy desire to live in peace would be a promising sign for their future endeavours with their new neighbours over in Canada, but half of the Blackfeet nickname reserved for perceived Catholic traitors seemed to follow them over the pond. Maybe it wasn't such a giant leap after all, though. The Donnellys moved from a farming town in Ireland full of Irish Catholics to a farming town in Canada full of Irish Catholic immigrants. Okay, well, then it doesn't seem likely that it was their outsider thing, because they're living in like a place where there's loads of other people like them. The landscape may have changed a bit, but the vibe was very similar in a population made up of people who sat on the opposite side of the barbed fence when it came to White Boys and Blackfeet. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here, as the Donnellys took quite a long-winded route to their new farming town. Jim and Judith Donnelly had married in County Tipperary, Ireland in 1840, and just 1 year later, their first of many children, James Jr., was born. It's not known exactly what year they decided to take the plunge and move to Canada, but it's generally believed that Jim set sail around 1842 and found a place to live before Judith and little James followed him within the same year. They made a bit of a false start by first settling down in the city of London in Ontario for a year or two, where Jim briefly worked as a tradesman before the Donnellys decided that city life wasn't for them. Yeah, I don't think city life would have been for me in the 18th century. 1842, yeah, they were kind of like, it was getting pretty polluted by that time, right? And filthy, and there's going to be horse shit everywhere. I'd be like, yeah, no, I'd rather live in the country. And also way less disease. I mean, there's way more disease in the city, less disease out in the country. Like, I like living in the city now because it's relatively nice, and there's like, emission standards, and there's not horses shitting everywhere. There's just not that much disease around, like, compared to the past where everyone was getting just consumption and dying. They were keen to get their hands dirty and carve out a new life as farmers in what was then known as the Biddulph Township in Upper Canada, which has since merged with the village of Lucan and is today known as Lucan Biddulph in southwest Ontario. The Biddulph Township wasn't a bad place To start, for a budding farmer preparing to plant his first crop and yank his first cow, the fertile region had been adopted by a large group of African Americans from Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1820s who had carried out much of the initial logging of the lands, but later struggled with the tough farming conditions and eventually abandoned their lots to return in defeat to city jobs. Under the ownership of the Canada Company, fresh attempts were made to sell the lots to potential new settlers from the UK at a relatively cheap price in a bid to get some productivity rolling out of this untapped wilderness, and it was an offer taken up by many Irish immigrants in the 1840s. And yet, relatively cheap was still far too expensive for many potential settlers, and what happened in many cases is that rich British property owners snapped up the lots without even bothering to pay them a visit. Yeah, that's the thing. Immediately I've seen there's cheap land. It's well, someone with a lot more money is going to come in and buy it all up. Unless, I'm surely you need to restrict this to people who live there or something like that. A bunch of places do this now, don't they? Whereas, you can only buy land and stuff if you're, a resident of that country or even of that city and stuff. Don't Germany do this, famously, to stop people doing Airbnbs and stuff? It's a bad idea to just make it cheap and then be hey, everyone can have it, because there's rich people in foreign countries that'll just come. And it just sat there in a casual hope that one day somebody might come along with enough money to rent their land and do something constructive with it. The Donnellys certainly didn't have enough money to buy or even rent land when they first showed up in the Biddulph township, but Jim and Judith weren't going to let a trivial matter like that scupper their grand plans. They came across a nice spot of 100 acres of land, which went under the official name of Lot 18, Concession 6, situated in an area known rather less officially as the Roman Line, so called because of the high volume of Roman Catholics who had already settled here during the last couple of years. The name also perhaps served as a warning that Protestants weren't particularly welcome around these parts. The problem was that this parcel of land was now owned by a guy called John Grace, who had recently acquired it from the Canada Company. But fortunately, John Grace was one of the many absent landlords who currently didn't seem all that interested in lording over his land. So Jim and Judith made themselves at home as the new squatters of Lot 18, Concession 6. This was a pretty common situation, which was often strongly supported by the courts back in the days of the Wild Wild West. The Donnellys were probably not even aware who actually owns Lot 18, whilst John Grace almost was certainly unaware that he had squatters on his land. Probably because John Grace is chilling in London or whatever, and he's just vaguely aware that he owns some land somewhere. And it's John Grace, it's kind of not a bad idea. Land's going cheap. There's, is it Mark Twain who said, invest in land, there's only a limited amount of it. It's not a bad plan. That land's probably worth something today. And John Grace the 17th is rich. Over the course of the next decade, the Donnellys built themselves a fancy homestead and a respectable working farm from the 100 acres of wilderness, whilst Judith also gave birth to another 6 sons: William, John, Patrick, Michael, Robert, and Thomas. Is that statistically likely? Is it random, or are some people more inclined to have boys and some people more inclined to have girls? Or is it just literally a 50-50 shot? Because 7 sons? God damn. By the 1850s, the Donnellys were established figures within the growing Biddulph township, although opinions of them appeared to be very mixed. Jim was a pretty short and stocky figure, reaching no taller than 5 feet 5 inches on the height chart he had probably plastered on the wall of his bedroom. But he could look after himself. Whilst he was seen by many as a fairly cordial and pleasant sort of chap with a large group of loyal friends, he was also known to get into occasional arguments and even fistfights after he'd been at the source down at the local tavern in the nearby village of Lucan, and he usually got the better of any guy who got a bit too lippy with him. Yeah, this sounds like just a reasonable dude. He's yeah, okay, I got lots of friends, I'm a pretty nice guy. Sometimes I get into fights when I get a bit drunk at the pub, but it's yeah, this seems very normal for the past. Meanwhile, Judith was seen as a cheerful and amiable soul, but she was also as tough as old boots and didn't take crap from anyone, and that apparently included animals. One completely unconfirmed rumor suggests that she once took a shortcut home across a neighbor's field and ended up getting chased back over the fence by a randy bull. The next morning, the bull was supposedly found dead with its tongue removed. Fucking hell, Judith. Why did you... I don't think you should go and shoot someone's bull because you climbed in its field and it got angry. Of course it's going to get angry. But I could vaguely understand why you'll be upset and then go and shoot it or whatever. But then you go over to it and just cut out its tongue? What, you some mafia trying to send the bulls a message? What the fuck? This might be a bit of idle gossip, but Judith was certainly not a woman to cross or to chase across a field under any circumstances, and she would become even more feisty as the years progressed and the hurdles she faced became ever more challenging. Feisty is one way to describe a woman who shot a bull, walked over to it and sliced out its tongue and then just left the rest of its body. Gina, she's a bit feisty. She'll cut out your tongue. There were many in the Biddulph township who felt the family fully deserved to reap the rewards of all of their hard labour, toiling away on the now prosperous farm they'd built up from nothing while raising 7 young sons. But there were others who viewed the Blackfeet Donnellys as cheeky squatters who were a bit rough around the edges and had no shame in conducting friendly business with Protestants outside of the Roman line instead of throwing eggs at them. So, again, like me with my future perspective, I'm like, oh, that's nice. Trying to get along rather than just like hating someone because of their religion. But back in the day, it's like, no, you better hate them. You better hate them because of their religion or we're going to ostracize you, which seems a bit intense, doesn't it? However, after enjoying a decade of life in their new homestead, the Donnellys faced a fresh problem in around 1857, which was a little more pressing than divided opinion in the community. Some guy had just turned up on their farm with a rather aggrieved expression on his face. He wanted to know what on earth they were doing on his land that he had just leased. Uh-oh, Mr. Grace enters the picture. The logging bee incident. John Grace, the original owner of Lot 18, Concession 6, had eventually sold the land to a guy named Michael Marr after doing precisely nothing with it for 10 years. I'll tell you what he was doing with it. He was just waiting for that land to appreciate in value. Yes! Michael Marr was clearly a bit more proactive than the previous owner, and he wasted no time at all in renting out the land to an Irishman by the name of Patrick Farrell, who arrived in Canada in 1857 with his family, fully expecting to develop a farm from scratch on his empty 100 acres of leased land. Patrick Farrell was naturally just a little perplexed when he finally made it to the property, only to find a family of 9 living in a cozy homestead and working on a farm that they reckoned belonged to them. Really? I guess they got to pull it off. You just be like, no, this is my land. I leased it from Peter. Yes, Peter. Now let's get this tied up in the courts for ages. It was reported that the initial heated discussion between Patrick Farrell and Jim Donnelly ended in a punch-up on the farm, and despite the fact that Patrick Farrell was a former blacksmith who was built like a brick house, he was sent packing after receiving a proper bruising from short-ass Jim. Yeah, but it's like, Jim seems like one of these guys who's like short and stocky and has been in so many fights that he needs to he can fight, and it doesn't matter how big Patrick Farrell is. Like, Jim's just going to be like, all right, then let's fucking go. And Patrick will be, beaten. He got his ass whipped by Jim, who's 5'5". But I wouldn't, I'm definitely way off 5'5", and I wouldn't like my chances against Jim. I mean, he's dead because this is the 19th century, but I still, if I was back in the night, I don't know why I need to explain this. I wouldn't go up against Jim if he was still alive. But Farrell wasn't going to give it up that easily. After getting barely any help from the local constabulary, many of whom were good friends of the Donnellys, Farrell took the case to court and argued that a bunch of no-good squatters were preventing him from accessing the lands that he had lawfully leased. If I was that dude, I'd be like, yo, what was the name? Michael, or whoever he leased it from. I'd be like, yo, the reason I leased this is because you're going to deal with the problems of leasing. It's like if you live in a rented flat and the boiler breaks, you're not like, oh, now if my boiler breaks, you're like, oh, for sake, got to go get the boiler fixed. And the boiler man comes, he's like, oh, it's going to be $1,000 or whatever. And you're like, oh, for fuck's sake. Whereas before, if your boiler breaks, you're just like, yo, landlord, boiler's broken, it's cold. And he'll come round, or he'll call a guy and he'll fix it, and the bill will be sent to him, and you're like, nice. So I'd just be like, bro, sort this out. Why do I have to go to court? It's not even my land. In response, the Donnellys argued that they now spent years breaking their backs in toiling on the land and developing a farm which now rightfully belonged to them, not some Johnny-come-lately who only thought he was leasing an empty spot of land. I'm sorry, Donnellys, but I don't think that's... You built that knowing the risks that someone could come along and be like, yo, that's my land. And it doesn't matter that 10 years have passed. It's not yours. The judge eventually made a ruling which some may find surprising. Patrick Farrell was allowed to lease exactly half of Lot 18, Concession 6, from the current landlord, but taking into account the work and improvements that the Donnellys had invested into the land, they were allowed to keep the other 50 acres for themselves, the good half that included the homestead and the hot tub. That sounds, in a way, like a fairly sensible compromise. But it's also perhaps quite understandable how neither party was entirely thrilled by the outcome. No, but it is a compromise, and if I was Patrick, I'd be pretty pissed off. If I were the Donnellys, I'd be like, holy shit, got 50 acres of land for free. Yes! For his part, Patrick Farrell was now only getting half of the land that had travelled all the way to Canada to farm, although it was in better shape than he had imagined. And whilst the Donnellys had been legally awarded 50 acres of land without having to pay anyone a cent, not a bad deal when you think about it, they'd now just lost half the land they'd been working on for the last 10 years. Tensions boiled between the neighbours over the next few weeks and months as Jim and Patrick began to loudly badmouth each other down at the tavern in Lucan, whilst each party also accused the other of getting up to mischief and sabotage over the wrong side of the fence at the now divided Lot 18 Concession 6. But it was a short-lived feud, which would all be over by the summer. Was this because one of the parties conceded defeat and moved away? No, because this is the casual criminals. They all got murdered, Danny. Or perhaps they settled their differences over a beer and a pickled egg and agreed to live in harmony for the rest of their lives. Well, no, not quite. The feud only stopped when one of them killed the other. So it all happened during a logging bee held on June the 27th, 1857. I assume Danny's about to explain to me what a logging bee is, because I have no idea. I was a bit confused for a while here, as I thought that a logging bee had something to do with the wild and wacky sport of log rolling. I imagine it's going to be like, how many trees can you fell in like an hour or whatever, like, lumberjack style. But we're talking about an entirely different logging bee in this case. We're talking about a productive social event in which good neighbors of the wild frontier get together to clear out a bit of space in the forest for the planting of crops. Ah, yes. What are we doing today? A little bit of deforestation? Yes. Most of the hard work was achieved in the morning, but things tended to slow down quite considerably after lunchtime when everyone had started knocking back the liquor provided by the generous host. Generous host. It's like, this is a good deal for them. It's like you just get a bunch of people who show up and clear some trees on your lands and you call it a party and then you just give them some booze. Be like, that's a good deal. Because otherwise you got to pay. I had a tree surgeon come and cut down a tree at my house and I was like, God damn, it's expensive. And I guess because they got like guys on like ropes and they're going up there and all that stuff. But still, like having someone cut down a tree is pricey. It would have been better if I'd just be like, yo, guys, you want a beer for all your hard work? And they'd be like, no, we're sending you an invoice. Fuck off. Like, it's expensive. This particular logging bee had been organized by neighbor Billy Maloney, and it turned out to be a well-attended and highly productive event at which both Jim Donnelly and Patrick Farrell were present. As usual, everyone had got off to a flying start during the first half of the day, but they had practically tossed the whole thing off by the late afternoon, and the liquor had started flowing. Yes! And it was, of course, during this late period of the day that Jim and Patrick finally found the time to begin hurling insults at each other, a neighborly exchange which swiftly led to a rowdy punch-up. But this was to be a fatal brawl, which concluded with Patrick Farrell lying dead on the floor with a logging handspike hanging out of his head. Holy shit, Jim, you murdered him! He's dead, Jim! Frustratingly, there were very few witnesses who actually saw the whole thing unfold, as Jim and Patrick had taken the polite step of stepping away from the main buzz of the logging bee crowd before throwing punches at one another. Well, I'll tell you what, when there's two people and they have a fight and one of them ends up dead with a spike in his head, it was the one who's not dead. He didn't spike himself in the head. Rumours initially surfaced from some of the attendees that the bigger and brawnier Patrick Farrell had been getting the better of Jim Donnelly on this occasion, and as a desperate last resort, Jim had picked up a handspike and used it to murder his opponent by driving it straight through his head. However, the local papers reported on the slightly different account told by some of the very few people who claimed to have actually witnessed the incident in full. These witnesses reckoned that Patrick had been the first to throw punches, and Jim had responded by knocking him down to the ground and walking away. As Jim's back was turned, Patrick got to his feet, picked up a handspike, and lunged at Jim in what appeared to be a purposeful attempt to kill him. Right at the last second, Jim spun around, picked up the first object at hand, which happened to be another logging handspike, and as Patrick bore down on his smaller opponent, Jim thrust the handspike upward to defend himself, but the handspike got lodged right in Patrick's head, killing him instantly. Whether the killing of Patrick Farrell was deliberate or entirely accidental, most witnesses agree that Jim didn't seem particularly upset at first that Farrell had died at his hands. Why would he be? He's like, this guy's a dickhead. I hate him. I'm getting in a fight with him and he tried to kill me. Or we had a big fight and I killed him. But it's like, either way, it's like, you would... I don't know, maybe should you just be upset because you killed someone? I don't know. If the guy was a dick, I'd be like, yeah, he's the way he is, isn't it? Just get on with my day. As a murderer. He did, however, grow a bit more concerned when the police were called to the logging bee and he suddenly realized that he was on the brink of getting arrested for murder. Shocking, isn't it, Jim, when you kill someone? Instead of remaining calm and explaining to the police it acted in self-defense, a point which could have been backed up by witnesses, Jim Donnelly instead panicked and fled into the wilderness, not to be seen again by anyone in the Biddulph township for well over a year. What? It's just in the woods? Well, I say he wasn't seen by anyone for over a year. That might not be quite true. There are a couple of theories which suggest that Jim hadn't actually fled very far at all. For starters, a few members of the community reported regular sightings of an unidentified woman toiling away on the Donnellys' farm alongside Judith. It's Jim in drag, isn't it? This mysterious female stranger was said to have a curious face that didn't look entirely dissimilar to that of the fugitive Jim Donnelly. But of course it couldn't be him, because Jim was on the run for the police and this new farmhand was clearly dressed in women's clothes. People in the past are a bit naive, aren't they? An even bigger clue, which may have indicated the close proximity of Jim Donnelly, is that his ever-faithful wife, Judith, somehow managed to conceive an 8th child during this period when Jim was officially missing. After popping out 7 sons, they finally got a girl with attempt number 8, and this last member of the original Donnelly clan was named Jenny. But it's pretty clear that Jim Donnelly had spent most of the year on the run, either lurking at home, working the farm while dressed in a cunning disguise, helping to conceive a child, or occasionally hiding out in the homes and stables of his loyal friends when it felt as if people might be bothering to look for him. It's maybe a little surprising that he managed to get away with this low-energy flight from justice for quite so long, particularly considering that it already built up a number of haters in the township who may have been pretty tempted by the juicy $400 reward that was being stumped up by the county council for his capture. Holy $400 in like 1820s or whatever? That is going to be worth a mega fortune today. It's believed that Jim may have been helped in no small measure by County Sheriff Ryder, who was assisting the fugitive in covering his somewhat half-assed tracks. Sheriff Ryder was a fellow Blackfoot who had known Jim since way back in the old days of Tipperary and Ireland. Some of the bit-off locals were now feeling aggrieved that Sheriff Ryder appeared to be making little effort to capture a fugitive who was hiding out on the town's doorstep. It may or may not have been entirely unrelated that sometime later, Sheriff Ryder was murdered for reasons unknown by a killer that was never identified. Why is so much murdering going on? These seem like very minor disputes. They're big disputes, sure, but like a lot of they're not big enough to be murdered over. Apparently they are. Jim Donnelly was never actually captured at all. It's just that after a year on the run, or at least a year on a casual stroll, he decided to turn himself into the police and face the music. This could have been because he was getting a bit nippy during the winter when he had to sleep in one of his mate's stables, or he might have just started to get fed up with dressing in women's clothes while working on the farm. Or perhaps he just began to feel a bit more confident that the consequences might not be so bad if he just explained exactly what had happened during the logging bee. The consequences couldn't have been much worse. Following a short trial at Huron County Courthouse, Jim Donnelly was found guilty of the murder of Patrick Farrell and sentenced to death by hanging, which was scheduled to take place 2 weeks later. Jim's going to be like, it was cold, but it's not that cold. I should have stayed in the barn. Still, a lot can happen in 2 weeks. We've already established that Judith Donnelly didn't take crap from anyone. And that didn't just apply to Randy Bulls, it also applied to Randy Judges. She told the judge right where to stick his death sentence and got him to change his mind. Well, kind of. In the rather uncharacteristic moment, tough old Judith petitioned the judge for clemency on the grounds that she was a helpless woman with 8 mouths to feed who needed Jim back working down on the farm. In the petition, which was signed by a long list of local supporters, she also points out that Jim's offense was committed without malice or premeditation and in the heat of passion. I kind of understand the last 2 points, but I'm not entirely sure it's possible to stick a handspike into your rival's head without just a slight hint of malice. Well, it is if it's complete self-defense. I mean, there's malice about like beating him up, but not to jam a spike into his head. But the judge agreed to look at Jim Donnelly's case again, and after concluding that Jim may have indeed acted in self-defense, the death sentence was commuted to 7 years in the Kingston Penitentiary. Jim Donnelly may have managed to slip through the hangman's noose, but he would be out of the picture for 7 years, and he'd be returning to a very different family when he was finally released. Yeah, 7 years for like young kids. My kids are 4 now. You went away to prison for like 7 years. Be 11 when they'll be starting my oldest will be starting secondary school when she comes out. When you get out of prison, you'll be like, oh no, I've missed a lot. She'll be like, who are you? I'll be like, I'm your dad. Oh, that's so sad. I don't like that. I'll try not to stick any spikes in people's heads. Hopefully I'll be fine. The rise of the Donnelly brothers. Judith certainly kept busy while her husband was banged up in prison, or the jail. Gaol. Old school spelling, as it was known back then. She faced a string of financial struggles and had to take out mortgages on the farm, but she kept those 8 mouths fed and proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that she was not the supposedly helpless woman who had helped her husband cheat death. Judith sold off a bit of the land to allow the building of a new schoolhouse which all her children attended, and this turned out to be a shrewd move as she also secured contracts to clean and organize events for the schoolhouse, which brought in chunks of extra wages during this financially challenging period. Those 7 sons had all been taught by Judith to take care of themselves from a very early age. age. Perhaps this was always going to be the Donnelly approach to parenting, but it could also be that Judith had grown increasingly embittered over what she perceived to be her husband's wrongful incarceration, alongside the faction of anti-Donnellys that now thrived in the Biddulph township. Just like herself, Judith's kids weren't going to take crap from anyone. In her own words, "From the time they could toddle, I taught my 7 sons to be foreign fist and club fighters. Shaw and Tiss, I who taught them how to gouge, bite off an ear, and crack in a head with a club, showed them the best way to send a fast punch to the chin." It was very hard to read and very brutal. Perhaps she taught them a little too well. By the time Jim Donnelly arrived back home, he found that his 7 young sons he'd left behind had grown up, and they'd grown up into feared, hard-drinking men who weren't afraid to throw a punch down at the local tavern or anywhere else, really. The second oldest son, William, was now seen as the leader of the pack. William had been born with a clubfoot and had suffered bullying and torment during his school days, but this only appears to have toughened him up more than the other Donnellys. In fact, he would quickly become seen as the head of the whole family, not just because of his brawn, but because he was also considered to be the smartest by far. Perhaps the white sheep of the Donnelly family was daughter Jenny, whom Jim Donnelly was now only meeting for the first time after being released from jail. In later life, Jenny seemed to be the only Donnelly who managed to avoid bar fights, regular brushes with the law, and the general controversies that were to engulf the rest of her family. Jenny's gentle nature and pleasant demeanor sparked idle gossip that she must have been adopted, or that perhaps Judith hadn't been quite as faithful as she claimed when her husband was hiding away in the cupboard under the stairs. Jenny never really had any enemies, and usually received a warm welcome wherever she went, but any potential boyfriends tended to keep their distance as soon as they realized she was a Donnelly, as they became scared of ever getting on the wrong side of Jenny's family. Yeah, it's like, Jenny's really nice and everything, but she's got 7 brothers who are fucking terrifying. You'd be like, stay away from Jenny. Jenny'd be like, oh, for sake. But did her brothers truly deserve their Hellraiser reputation? All 7 of them, James Jr., William, John, Patrick, Michael, Robert, and Thomas, certainly got into their fair share of scrapes and fights and troubles with the law, but this was hardly unique in the area. The Biddulph township was known to be a pretty dangerous place, crammed full of criminals and hooligans and ne'er-do-wells. John A. Macdonald, then Attorney General and the future first Prime Minister of Canada, received a letter from a local authority in 1859 which pulled no punches on the current state of the Roman line in particular. The letter warned, "There is a section of the township of Biddulph inhabited by the lower order of Roman Catholics where a person's life is not considered of any value. Even the judges are not safe in the area. It's wise only to go about during daylight hours." Now, the Donnellys probably weren't that much different from any of their neighbours. It's just that they were considered tougher than most, and they were not a family to be messed with. According to one long-standing rumour, it took just 3 of the Donnelly brothers to whip the asses of no less than 17 men during an epic barroom brawl, after which all 17 opponents ran away to nurse their bruises, whilst the trio of victorious Donnellys just casually mooched back to the bar to get the next round in. No shot. There's no way that they're taking on 17 people, but with 3 of them. Well, they like fucking ninjas or something? Some have argued that the Donnellys were not the villains that they're often made out to be. Every member of the family worked their fingers to the bone, and some of the sons went on to find great success in legitimate business, even if that turned out to be just as controversial as every other aspect of their lives, as we'll soon discover. Their supporters have suggested that the Donnellys were essentially a close-knit and industrious family who knew they had to fight their corner and stand up for themselves in a town riddled with crime and violence and knobheads. Others have argued that the Donnellys were a law unto themselves who regularly crossed the line and got away with a ridiculous number of brutal crimes across a region in which many of the untrained constables were often just as bad as the criminals, a region in which witnesses were often too scared to testify in court, and a region in which juries often seemed strangely reluctant to convict anyone on the strength of hard evidence, whilst judges often seemed equally reluctant to pass adequate sentences for serious crimes. You know your justice system is broken, where the people putting people in jail are afraid of retribution. Like, you see this with, like, gangs and stuff in, like, cartel country in, like, South America and stuff, and, like, in countries that are a bit broken. And you're just like, that is not good. That, I feel, and, like, the president stealing all the money, that's, like, some real, your country's kind of vibes. right? Aside from Jenny, just about all of the Donnellys were destined to face a relentless chain of allegations over the next couple of decades, and most of them were destined to spend at least a short time in jail, although the overwhelming majority of charges leveled against them would never result in a conviction. But the jury's still out on whether the Donnellys were the true terrors of the town who rarely got caught, or whether they were just unfairly copping the blame for every heinous act that ever took place in a crooked township where judges feared to tread. A crooked township which was gradually turning against the family in even bigger numbers. The Stagecoach Feud and Other Tales of Woe. Bob McLean was no fan of the Donnellys. This fellow farmer in the Bdulph township was beginning to get fed up with having to replace all the tools that were getting stolen from his shed on a regular basis. Bob felt convinced that those wretched Donnellys were behind it, and he eventually made a furious complaint to the constabulary in which he accused the Donnellys of persistent theft. Later that same week, poor old Bob McLean endured quite a terrible run of jolly bad luck. His cattle were poisoned, the throats of his horses were slit, and his barn was razed to the ground. Oh my god. Getting some fucking mob justice. It's like massive overreaction. You'll be forgiven for suspecting that the Donnellys may have been responsible, but we'll never know for sure, as Bob McLean decided to keep his mouth shut in the future. Pretty smart, Bob. Oh my god, they're gangsters. Now, we'd be here all day if we actually went through every single occasion over the next few decades in which the Donnelly brothers were accused of something or the other. Various allegations, including larceny, a post office robbery, and assault, were leveled against the brothers, but they were usually acquitted of all charges. A few notable exceptions include an incident in 1875 when James Jr. was found guilty of assaulting a fruit vendor but was cleared of the accompanying theft charge. That very same year, several brothers became involved in a street brawl in which they resorted to hurling giant rocks at their opponents, but only Thomas was found guilty of assault. Giant rocks. Okay. And of course, a wedding was never destined to end well in the rowdy Bdulph township. The 1876 wedding of local man Thomas Ryder escalated into a full-on riot when a bunch of constables turned up on the happy day with the intention of arresting a whole bunch of Donnellys for recent alleged crimes. Shots were fired between the Donnellys and the somewhat bumbling constables, who managed to let their targets briefly escape from the scene, although William and John were later convicted of assaulting a constable. A couple of years later, Robert Donnelly was found guilty of attempting to murder one Constable Samuel Everett, who claims that his attacker had fired shots at him from behind whilst the constable was just trying to open the front door of his own house. Robert Donnelly was sentenced to 2 years in the Kingston Penitentiary, but a year later, Constable Everett himself was in hot water after being convicted of assaulting another constable, and during this period, he made the startling admission that he wasn't completely sure who had attempted to shoot him in the back in the darkness. He just kind of assumed that it might be Robert. And this dude went to prison for that? That's f***ed up. Also, he only got, if it was him, right? If it was him, he only got 2 years in jail. I mean, it wasn't, but someone did it. And they thought it was him, and they were like, yeah, 2 years, that'll work. Whereas when he was in a fist fight with someone, and he put a spike in his head, and in kind of like self-defense, maybe, he got 7 years, was it? This doesn't seem to have affected Robert's prison sentence. What? Which he served in full. But it's interesting to note that if Constable Everett's mysterious attacker had hit his target, and Constable Everett had died later from his wounds after pointing the finger at Robert, then Robert Donnelly would almost certainly have been hung for his crime. The Donnellys didn't seem to have much time for constables in general. Perhaps one of their biggest foes was a guy called Constable James Carroll, who first rolled into town in 1879 and seemed to take an instant dislike to the family, to say the least. During one early altercation, William and John Donnelly were convicted of throwing stones at the constable, and they were fined $3 each. Meanwhile, Mother Judith was charged with the shocking crime of using abusive language against the presumably traumatized Constable James Carroll, who claimed that words such as rogue and blackguard were lobbed recklessly in his direction. Oh, someone called me a rogue. I guess it was worse back in the day. Today, if someone called you a rogue, you'd be like, hell yeah, I'm a rogue. I'm roguish. For her part, Judith reckoned that the words were used in retaliation after the constable pulled a gun on her and declared that he would enjoy shooting her just as much as he'd enjoy shooting one of her vagabond sons. Holy shit, no wonder she called you a rogue. It may all seem like fairly small fry stuff for now, and leaving aside the allegation involving the gun, it sounds like the kind of thing that was probably going on every day between children in the schoolhouse. But the relationship between the Donnellys and Constable James Carroll was about to take a significantly darker turn. The saga of the Donnellys surely can't all be about petty crime and bar brawls and assassination attempts and throwing quite big stones. What about the inevitable romantic love stories and the family's later game-changing move into big business? Well, there's plenty to say about all of that, but all such events were equally, if not even more, marred in controversy and kidnapping and fire and deaths. The leader of the brothers, William, fell in love with a local woman by the name of Maggie Thompson. The young couple had reportedly been going steady for 4 or 5 years, and William fully intended to marry Maggie. But there was one minor snag. Maggie's father, also called William, so let's call him Mr. Thompson, couldn't stand the Donnellys and wasn't even aware that his daughter had been stepping out with William for the last few years. And he didn't seem too thrilled about the prospect of wedding bells. In his own words, I had no idea she was keeping company with a Donnelly, and would rather see her going to her grave than having my consent to marry him. Jesus Christ, Dad. I'd rather you were dead than marry him. Christ, the past. A series of preserved letters between William Donnelly and Maggie Thompson reveal how Maggie, at one point, begged her lover to come and rescue her from the clutches of her father so that they could go and get married, and William duly obliged, or at least he gave it a good go. He pulled together a gang of his closest associates who then descended on the Thompson household in a bid to find Maggie and spirit her away to freedom. Suspecting that Mr. Thompson had already got wind of their plan, William and the gang also forced their way into the houses of Thompson's neighbours, just in case Mr. Thompson had hidden away his daughter down the road. It seems that Mr. Thompson had been smarter than that, as William's mob never found Maggie on that night. Instead, the gang were all charged with trespassing, but in typical Donnelly style, William and his friends managed to somehow get acquitted of the charge, despite the large number of witnesses. It turns out that Thompson's good neighbours, the Tooheys, had helped hide Maggie in a more discreet location, but the Tooheys were now understandably annoyed that William and his cronies had come barging into the house to search every nook and cranny for the missing bride. This went down in history as the night the Donnellys made enemies of both the Thompsons and the Tooheys, and the incident would not be forgotten. It's not entirely clear what happened to old Maggie Thompson, but William seemed to have forgotten all about his lost love within the space of a year as he married Nora Kennedy in 1875. Shortly afterward, he moved out of the Donnelly household, but he clearly didn't fancy straying too far from the flock as he and his new wife Nora moved just down the road to a new property called Wayland's Corners. While the wedding itself seemed to go off without a hitch, certainly no signs of brawls or stone throwing or gunfire or death by logging headspike, there were already hostilities brewing between William and his new in-laws. Sadly, it seems that the Kennedys didn't care much for the Donnellys either, and Nora's brothers seemed particularly unhappy about Nora's choice of husband, leading to yet more feuding in the years to come. We can add the Kennedys to the ever-growing list of Donnelly enemies and scrap any hope of a half-decent wedding present. William and Nora Donnelly probably just got towels. Seriously, who thinks that towels are really a good idea for a wedding present? People give towels as wedding presents? I was gifted about 12 different sets of towels for my wedding. I don't need that many towels. All I actually wanted was a Mr. Frosty ice crunchie maker, and that was nowhere to be seen. Who gives towels? It's a bit weird. Don't people have wedding lists? You just have a list of things that you want, and then people choose something for that? Otherwise, you'd get, like, I don't know, I'd say lots of things that are the same, but I didn't think any of those things would be towels. Towels are like one of those things that I want to choose myself, because I want to go to the store, I want to feel the towels and be like, well, that's a nice one. I like that. Rather than, like, I don't know, getting gifted them and you're like, oh, this is a bit rough, I don't like it. Still, William and Nora were probably living quite comfortable lives in Wayland Corners and couldn't care less if the Kennedys very rarely came round to watch the big game on the widescreen TV. By the time he was married, William had turned his attention away from helping out on the family farm and into the lucrative business of stagecoach lines. William and several other brothers had started working for the McPhee and Keefe stagecoach line in 1871, but the business folded just a couple of years later, which would have been delightful news for the owner of the main stagecoach rival, John Hawkshaw, who may well have started to rub his hands in glee. But Hawkshaw wouldn't have been rubbing his hands for very long. William decided to start his own new stagecoach line and roped in brothers Michael, Robert, and Thomas to help drive the stages. Stagecoaches is just like horses pulling carts, right? Is that a stagecoach? The Donnelly stagecoach line ran between London, Lucan, and Exeter, and soon gave John Hawkshaw more of a run for his money than the old McPhee and Keefe line had ever managed. In fact, although Hawkshaw had been running his line for decades, he was so troubled by this new rival that he conceded defeat within the very same year and sold his business to an Irishman by the name of Patrick Flanagan, who clearly was more determined to put up a fight. This was the beginning of the stagecoach feud, which spanned for a total of 5 years, during which period the stages on each line were regularly sabotaged, horses were tortured and killed. Why would you torture them? Why, just stop it. Just kill them. Don't kill them at all, but why would you torture animals? The passengers risked facing a barrage of potshots from passing gunmen every time they went out for a ride, and of course every time either the Donnelly or Flanagan lines encountered trouble of any kind, each blamed the other. One of the biggest tragedies occurred in 1875 when William Brox, a stage driver for Flanagan, was killed when one of the wheels fell off the stage, prompting speculation that the Donnellys had deliberately sabotaged the stage and caused the death of the driver, although this was never proved. Yeah, but by doing that, aren't they going to get retribution and then unscrew all of yours? And that's gonna be real bad. During the same year, Patrick Flanagan popped out to his barn, only to find that some little scoundrel had completely destroyed one of his stages and physically attacked one of his horses. Immediately suspecting the Donnellys, he angrily gathered together a large group of his hardest mates and marched over to the Donnelly household to exact some rough justice. Oh yeah, but these guys are scary hard. There's a rumor that 3 of them took on like 17 dudes in a pub. It didn't quite go as planned. The lynch mob were greeted by Jim Donnelly and most of his sons, all of whom were reportedly armed with clubs and ready for battle. Even though the Donnellys were heavily outnumbered, they absolutely battered Flanagan's mob. And it may or may not have been entirely coincidental that very shortly afterwards, Patrick Flanagan's entire barn was burnt down. The Donnellys had always been used to answering charges leveled against them, but things got particularly hectic during the Stagecoach feud. Within the first 3 months of 1876 alone, the family faced no less than 33 separate charges relating to assault, shootings, arson, and theft, and although they were usually acquitted, a few of the brothers did spend short stints in jail around this time. The Stagecoach feud finally came to an end in 1878, but that's not because of an unlikely truce or because either side was victorious. In fact, both sides lost the war. The launch of an all-new London Huron-Bruce railway meant that trains were on the way in and horses were on the way out. Enter the Peacekeeper. Not all of the Donnelly family would make it as far as the 1880s. Eldest son James Jr. died in 1877 from what was officially described as pneumonia, although others have suggested that he was shot dead by one of the family's many rivals. However, as there's no evidence to back up that theory, it might have just been that even in the wild arena of the Biddulph township, people sometimes still die from natural causes without anyone having to stick a logging handspike into their head. Yeah, it's the 1880s. People dying like left, right, and centre. It's kind of amazing that all of these children survive to adulthood. It's the 1880s. It'd be like, oh, well, you got tuberculosis. How long you got to live? 6 months. It was the past. People dying all the time. It was reported that in a rather moving gesture, the surviving brothers honoured his death by going out and pummeling anyone who had ever said a bad word about James Jr. It's what he would have wanted. And the thing is, like, Daddy says that, but it is what he would have wanted, because they're like violent yobbos. The death of the third youngest brother, Michael, in 1879 was a lot more dramatic and perhaps closer to what you might expect. Following the closure of the Stagecoach empire, Michael had moved away to the city of St. Thomas, where he'd secured a new job at the Canada Southern Railroad. After clocking off what would turn out to be his last ever working day, Michael popped into a saloon in Waterford for light refreshments. God, retirement's got to be weird, right? I know this is not him not retiring, but I just had this image of like leaving work for the last time, and you're just like, yeah, just never going back to work. God, that's weird. And you just wake up the next day and be like, never go to work again. And I guess like 2 weeks later, you're like, yeah, this is my life now. Like, my parents are both retired, and they've got into their retirement, and it seems like nice. Maybe I will retire someday. Not anytime soon. And it's like, I really like what I do. So I don't know what I'd do with my spare time. He became embroiled in a heated argument with a fellow employee by the name of William Lewis. This argument rapidly evolved into another brawl, surprise, surprise, but Michael was unaware that his opponent had a concealed knife on his person. According to local newspaper reports, Michael was stabbed in the groin, after which he staggered around the bar and exclaimed, "Boys, I am gone," before falling dead to the floor. It's speculated that William Lewis had been working for a faction of the anti-Donnelly mob and had been tasked with the job of deliberately winding up Michael so that he could be stabbed with a concealed knife. But it sounds more likely that there was just a dust-up between two employees which got out of hand, and if Lewis had been working for somebody else, the payoff wasn't particularly rewarding, as he ended up serving a long stint in Kingston Penitentiary, but for manslaughter rather than murder. Yeah, it's like they were in a fight, so that seems fair. Back in the Biddulph township, the local feuds had intensified more than ever by 1880, and the Donnellys were now perhaps unfairly copping the blame for absolutely everything as more and more members of the community turned against them, and loyal friends became harder to find. If a horse got its throat slit, it was the Donnellys. If a store was robbed, it was the Donnellys. If a kid got his ice cream stolen by a seagull, it was the Donnellys. At around this time, William complained to the local press that somebody had stuck a sign up next to the community well in the middle of town, which warned, "No more water for the Blackfeets out of this well. Go up to old Donnellys and get your water." Curiously, William himself didn't seem to understand the origin of the term Blackfeet and assumed that it was meant to describe the few residents of the town who defied the rest of the community by continuing to associate with the Donnellys, and it's possible that the term may have evolved over the years to mean exactly that. But as the residents of the township continued to bicker and brawl and steal from their neighbors and poison each other's cattle, a new face arrived in town who was destined to play a huge role in finally turning this unruly place around, although perhaps not in the way he envisioned or hoped. This man was on a mission to put an end to the feuding and criminal mayhem for good, but we're not talking about a no-nonsense gun-toting constable here, and we're certainly not talking about Constable James Carroll, whose idea of eradicating the problem seemed to be based around the idea of just taking out the Donnellys. No, we're talking about a man who went by the name of Father John Connolly. Yeah, I was like, immediately I thought this dude's, it's going to be like a vicar or someone. It's going to be someone who's like religious. That's who. When the Irishman, Father Connolly, arrived from Quebec and took up his new position as the priest of St. Patrick's Catholic Church in the Biddulph Township, he was more than aware of the ongoing feud between the Donnellys and pretty much the rest of the community, as well as the high volume of crimes and violent incidents that pervaded the town as a whole. If I was that priest, I'd be like, oh no, you sent me here. That's where you think I'm needed, and I know I'm needed there, but can't I just go to the nice place where people just show up to church, they put some money in that little plate? That's that kind of thing. That's more of a vibe. Father Connolly sought to restore peace in Biddulph, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that Father Connolly sought to introduce the idea of peace to Biddulph for the first time. He came up with the sweet idea of forming the Peace Association, in which members of the community met up on a regular basis to discuss the most effective ways of embracing peace, love, harmony, and vegetarian cuisine. Okay then. In a bid to build new trust between neighbors, members of the Peace Association were invited to sign a pledge which granted permission to have all their homes searched whenever a theft was reported. It sounds like quite a smart idea in a way. There was no way you'd ever succumb to the temptation of stealing a corn planter from the guy down the road if you knew that your property was going to be searched regularly by the Peace Association. But there was a problem. Of course there's a problem. Anyone who's actually doing stealing is going to be like, no. Because it's a voluntary thing. It's not the law. Whilst the majority of the townsfolk joined up with the Peace Association, there was one family who made a notable exception and refused to sign the pledge or have anything to do with Father Connolly's new group. Guess if you can name that family. See if you can guess the name of that family. It's the Connellys. Not the Connollys. God damn it, the Donnellys. It's Father Connolly. Everyone's an Unnerly, because they're Irish. Now, it's often reported that Father Connolly ended up becoming yet another enemy of the Donnellys, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. There were certainly more than a few differences of opinion tossed around between Donnelly and Connolly. The priest was obviously disappointed that the family refused to sign his peace pledge, and he wasn't mad keen on the Donnellys associating with Protestants. He was particularly miffed when Jim Donnelly donated a significant chunk of money to the building of a nearby Anglican church. Meanwhile, the Donnellys felt that Father Connolly was prone to spouting anti-Protestant rhetoric, prompting a scene in which Jim felt compelled to stand up in church and lambast the priest for preaching hatred from his pulpit. But it seems that Father Connolly was determined to try and get along with the Donnellys in his efforts to usher in a new era of peace for the town. And he was usually made very welcome whenever he paid a visit to the Donnelly homestead for tea and scones, although he was given short shrift if he ever tried to persuade the family that things might get better if they just stopped behaving like heads all the time. Oh, God. Yeah, they're not going to, because they're dickheads. However, whilst Father Connolly had the best intentions at heart when forming the Peace Association, the Donnellys' refusal to take part and sign the pledge had only served to deepen the rift between the family and the rest of the town. And now certain members of the Peace Association were getting a little frustrated at Father Connolly's gentle and patient approach. They decided that firmer action needed to be taken immediately. And with that in mind, they formed a secret splinter group with a very different agenda. They called themselves the Vigilance Committee. Missing cows and bonfires. This new grumpy group included Constable James Carroll, as well as members of families who were sworn enemies of the Donnellys, including the Thompsons, the Tuohys, and the Kennedys, who were, of course, William Donnelly's own in-laws. They met up in secret at Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse to discuss the most effective way of solving the Donnelly problem for good, but this time there was no signing of peace pledges. The early plan seemed to be quite tame in comparison to what was to follow in February 1880. It seemed for a while as if the Vigilance Committee was focused more on childish pranks rather than brutal retribution. For example, there was the mystery of the missing cow, which sounds like the title of an abandoned famous 5 novel. You may remember that Mr. William Thompson was the father of Maggie, whom he somehow managed to keep hidden away from William Donnelly forever. I didn't, but now I do. Now I think about it, I hope Mr. Thompson didn't actually kill Maggie, as he did make it clear that he would rather see his daughter dead than married to a Donnelly. Mr. Thompson was also a member of the Vigilance Committee, as was his son, William Jr., and it was William Jr. who reported that one of his cows had been stolen, prompting his buddies on the committee to turn up on the doorstep of the Donnelly homestead armed with sticks, demanding to search the property. I suspect the Peace Association had already searched the property of everyone else, so the Donnellys were now the only remaining suspects. Yeah, but the thing is, with the Peace Association, if everyone else has signed up, then just by process of elimination, you'll be like, well, it's the Donnellys, isn't it? I mean, that kind of works. Surprisingly, Jim Donnelly didn't put up much of a fight. The property was searched, and there was no sign of the missing cow. The mob then went down the road to demand to search Wayland Corners, the home of William and Nora Donnelly. Again, no sign of a missing cow, and William didn't seem to get too annoyed about the whole thing, although the Donnellys would later make an unsuccessful attempt to get the cow hunters convicted of trespassing. The cow was found very shortly afterwards, after having apparently just gone astray in nearby woods. But it was speculated that the whole missing cow incident was orchestrated by members of the Vigilance Committee. Oh, it's a false flag! Perhaps even by Thompson Sr. or Thompson Jr. in an attempt to wind up the Donnellys and goad them into a fight in which they would be outnumbered. Not that this necessarily makes much of a difference when you're dealing with the Donnellys. No, it doesn't. 17 dudes in a bar taken out by 3 of them. That's like some Jack Reacher. Of more concern was the night of January the 15th, 1880, on which a barn belonging to one of Jim Donnelly's neighbors was set ablaze, and the fingers of suspicion naturally pointed straight at the Donnellys. Patrick Grouchy Ryder was the neighbor in question, and he seemed a little confused. He had been neighbors with the Donnellys for years, and had never had so much as a minor quarrel over turnips with them. In fact, the Donnellys and the Ryders had a history stretching way back to the Ireland days, as Grouchy was related to the Constable Ryder, who may have helped Jim evade capture before losing his own life under shady circumstances. Grouchy seemed reluctant at first to lay the blame at the Donnellys' door, but it seems that he got swept up in the rumors and gossip that was circling around the township. Although it was never proven, it now seems incredibly likely that the barn had actually been burnt down by members of the Vigilance Committee in an attempt to frame the Donnelly brothers. These guys, they're just looking for you could see how these guys end up getting murdered, because they're just looking for excuses. They're false flagging the shit out of this. If that was the plan, though, it kind of backfired. All of the brothers who still lived in the area were actually attending a local wedding on the night the barn was ravaged by flames, so they weren't exactly short of an alibi or two. As a desperate last resort, the Vigilance Committee, now backed by a slightly hesitant Grouchy Ryder, decided to try and pin the blame on Jim and Judith Donnelly, who were home that night. This seems to be stretching credibility a little bit, as Jim and Judith were both in their 60s by this point, and I'm sure they could find better ways of spending their golden years than setting fire to their good neighbor's barn for absolutely no reason at all. Nevertheless, despite the complete lack of evidence and almost zero chance of convictions, Jim and Judith were scheduled to face trial on the 4th of February 1880. For reasons beyond their control, they wouldn't be able to make that date. The Black Donnellys Massacre. Perhaps feeling a little deflated that their alleged plot hadn't quite planned out in the way they'd hoped, the Vigilance Committee reconvened at Cedar Swamp Schoolhouse to consider the next move, and they were thinking of strategies which went way beyond barn fires and runaway cows. They were planning a full-on assault. The committee had a spy working for them, James Fearley, who was supposedly a good friend of the Donnellys, who paid regular visits to the homestead, but the Vigilance Committee somehow bullied him into furnishing them with reports as to the movements and routines of the household, so that a solid plan of attack could be formed when the family least suspected it. Ideally, the committee wanted to get their hands on as many Donnellys as they could at the homestead, but they knew they would have to make a separate visit to Wayland Corners to deal with the ringleader of the pack, William. That seems like a bad idea. If you want to take these people out, right? And I'm assuming they want to, kill them. Why would you do them all together? You'd just wait till they're alone, and then you'd off one of them, and then you'd off another one. Why would you try and approach them all together? That seems like a terrible idea. One of the new plans involved storming into the homes of the family, handcuffing the lot of them, and then dragging them to the woods where they'd be hanged from trees until they confessed to every crime that they'd ever committed. But the plans were to take even more drastic turns with every new committee meeting. Father Connolly had got wind that something was brewing within a secret splinter group and urged his congregation to be wary of this evil that has fallen among the community. Most of his congregation probably suspected he was referring to the Donnellys, exactly what I thought, rather than the secret society, who were now determined to wipe them out. On February the 3rd, 1880, the The Donnellys were preparing for tomorrow's day in court, where they were supposed to be on trial for the burning of Grouchy Rider's barn. Now, that might seem like quite a daunting event for a regular family, but considering how often the Donnellys have been hopping in and out of court over the last 3 decades, they probably viewed this as another opportunity for a grand day out and may have planned to pick up a few doner kebabs on the way back home. It's worth pointing out just how many Donnellys were still living in Biddulph Township at this point, and just how many lives were now in imminent danger. As we already mentioned, 2 of the Donnelly brothers, James Jr. and Michael, were already deceased. The 4th oldest brother, Patrick, had long since moved out of the area and into the city of Thorold, where he worked as a wagon maker and enjoyed a happy life with his wife and children. Sounds like Patrick made a good decision. Of all the Donnelly brothers, Patrick was the one who had the least scrapes with the law and seemed to prefer a quieter life. He had only recently written a letter to his father Jim, which urged him to sell the farm and leave behind the troubled township to start a new life in a place where not everybody hated him. Patrick expressed his concern that if Jim and Judith didn't get out of Biddulph soon, something terrible might happen to them. It's like, guys, everybody hates you. You should leave. Jim replied that he and Judith had no desire to leave the farm, and it's a shame he didn't listen to his son. Second youngest brother, Robert, had also moved away shortly after being released from jail for the alleged murder attempt on Constable Everett, whilst I'm pleased to report that only daughter Jenny managed to finally overcome the problem of the family name, scaring away potential partners. She married a man called James Curry and moved to Glencoe, thankfully escaping the gruesome events that were to unfold on the night of February 3rd. Yep, Patrick and Jenny, the smart ones of the family, who left the town where everyone hates them and hates their name and just went off and had a nice happy life somewhere else. So that leaves us with Jim and Judith still living at the homestead with just 2 of their sons, John and Thomas, while William lived nearby at Wayland's Corners. But one problem faced by the Vigilance Committee is that they were struggling to figure out who was where on the night that they planned to attack. Targets presumed to be at the homestead were absent, whilst there were other individuals staying at the homestead whose presence the committee hadn't reckoned on. John Donnelly was presumed to be at the homestead where he still lived with his parents, but had actually popped over to his brother William's home where he intended to stay the night. Meanwhile, Bridget Donnelly was the 21-year-old niece of Jim and Judith who had travelled from Ireland to spend an enchanting holiday with her weird relatives in Canada. Oh my god. It's not like you just pop over to Canada. Isn't she going to be on a boat for like 3 weeks? And then we have 13-year-old Johnny O'Connor. Johnny was a young farmhand who had been working hard all day for the Donnellys and had agreed to take care of the farm the following day when Jim and Judith would be away in court. With that in mind, Jim had invited Johnny to spend the night at the homestead, as there would be little point of having him go home just to come back the next morning at the crack of dawn and wake up the cockerel. This changed the usual sleeping arrangements quite a bit, as Jim invited Johnny to sleep in the main bed with him. A man in his 60s inviting a 13-year-old boy to share his bed would probably be frowned upon today, but these were more innocent times, and Jim was really offering Johnny a form of protection and reassurance of bedding with the gaffer in the big bed. Yeah, I mean, it's the past. Like, didn't whole families used to sleep in the same bed together and stuff because there was only one bed? So this meant that Judith was temporarily booted out of the master bedroom and instead shared a bed with niece Bridget in the room next door, whilst Thomas Donnelly was sleeping in his usual room near the kitchen, and John Donnelly had left the house to spend the night with William and Nora at Wayland's Corners. Shortly before everyone had retired to bed, that sneaky two-faced bag James Fihili had popped around to the homestead to exchange pleasantries with his friends, but he was actually reporting back to the Vigilance Committee on who exactly was in the property. He didn't do a very good job, though. Although he heard the voice of Johnny O'Connor in the background, he mistook it to be the voice of John Donnelly, who was already getting comfy down at Wayland's Corners. So, the committee had no idea that a young teenage boy was on the premises when the mob of around 30 men descended on the homestead around 1 a.m. for a final devastating showdown with the Black Donnellys. Now look, things are going to get a bit rough from here on in, but let's kick off with a welcome slice of good news. 13-year-old farmhand Johnny O'Connor was not hurt during the onslaught that took place in the early hours of February the 4th, 1880. The reason that I'm divulging that now is partly to ease any concern over the young boy's welfare, but mainly because it's important to note that the majority of the following events are from Johnny's own recollections based on what he saw and heard on that night. There were apparently a few other witnesses who observed a large group of men making their way to the homestead, although nobody else seemed to be sure who was in the group. Some of them were dressed in women's clothing for reasons that I can't quite fathom, and armed with pitchforks and axes and shovels and various other implements which probably weren't intended for a spot of late-night farming. The mob was believed to have been led by Constable James Carroll, whilst members of the Toohey and Kennedy families, and perhaps surprisingly former friends from the Ryder families, brought up the rear. The men arrived at the homestead and surrounded the entire property. Constable Carroll let himself in through the back door, which was unlocked. Apparently back in those days, everyone always left their doors unlocked at night because burglary hadn't been invented yet. The constable crept in and came across a sleeping Thomas Donnelly, who he immediately handcuffed whilst proclaiming that he was under arrest. Thomas understandably began to make a few vocal protestations regarding this unexpected disturbance, and the heated argument between the two men woke up the rest of the household, prompting Jim, Judith and Bridget to come racing downstairs to see what all the fuss was about. Slightly weirdly, Judith instructed Bridget to go and make a nice fire, which seems a bit of an odd gesture if it was intended to make everyone nice and warm and comfortable. Thomas demanded to see an arrest warrant, but his request was met with a barrage of fists from members of the mob. Still handcuffed while receiving this beating, Thomas still somehow managed to break away from his attackers and flee through the front door with the intention of raising the alarm, whilst the mob now turned their attention to Jim and Judith. Niece Bridget had fled upstairs in panic back to the bedroom in which she'd been sleeping. A terrified Johnny O'Connor had quietly emerged from the master bedroom and had attempted to follow Bridget, but in the heat of the moment, she had flung the door in his face and locked it. Johnny retreated back to the master bedroom and crept underneath the bed, where he remained hidden, peeking through a crack which the valance would usually have covered, as the chaos unfolded downstairs. Whilst Thomas Donnelly had done well to make it through the front door, he didn't get very far. He was dragged straight back into the house by members of the mob who had been guarding the exterior and thrown to the floor. His attackers took the time to remove his handcuffs before one of the mob took a shovel and repeatedly struck Thomas over the head with it until his head was cracked open, whilst others thrust pitchforks deep inside him. Jesus Christ. Okay. Jim and Judith Donnelly did not witness the brutal death of their youngest son. They had already been beaten black and blue by clubs until their bodies stopped moving. The family dog had been barking throughout the whole ordeal, but was silenced when one of the mob cracked its skull open with a shovel. As far as the gang were aware, there was just one potential witness, 21-year-old Bridget Donnelly, who was still hiding in an upstairs locked bedroom. A few members of the mob dashed upstairs to bash down the door and deal with the visiting niece. By the time they brought Bridget downstairs, she was already dead. The mob abandoned all four bodies, well, 5 if you include the dog, on the kitchen floor as they doused coal oil all over the homestead and set fire to the property before making their exit into the night. Whilst it's been suggested that Jim Donnelly's eyes had been gouged out, Judith had been scalped, and Thomas Donnelly had been castrated and decapitated, I suspect that some people might be embellishing a story that doesn't really need any embellishment. No, it's already incredibly brutal. What we do know for sure is that only charred remains of the bodies were uncovered when the fires finally stopped burning at Lot 18, Concession 6. Johnny O'Connor had managed to make it out of the homestead before it burned to the ground. He raced down to the kitchen, quickly stepped over the 4 battered bodies and darted through the back door. He didn't stop running until he reached the house of a good neighbour, Patrick Whelan. Patrick was obviously a little discombobulated about having been woken up at 1:30 a.m. by a young, screaming teenager who was hysterically attempting to explain that the Donnellys had just been murdered. Quite lucky this kid managed to escape, right? Patrick was initially unsure if he should believe the boy, but was also understandably hesitant about approaching the scene if a mob of up to 30 angry men were still hanging around with pitchforks. He eventually woke up his 2 grown sons and persuaded them to accompany him on a trip to the homestead, leaving Johnny in the care of his wife, who begged the boy not to tell her anything about what had just happened. It's like, yeah, I don't want to know. By the time Patrick Whelan and his sons had cautiously approached the homestead, the flames were beginning to die down. They came across the remains of bodies which they were unable to identify. However, the work of the Vigilance Committee was not yet complete. Although they were a little puzzled as to why John Donnelly had not been present at the homestead, their only concern now was to nail the ringleader of the pack, William. And this would involve a second late-night journey, which would culminate at Wayland's Corners. It appears that the numbers may have dwindled somewhat by the time the mob arrived at the house of William and Nora Donnelly. Perhaps some of the original mob had decided that it was seriously getting a bit late to be out and about. Others may have turned back home with complaints of aching arms. I hope it's not inconceivable that some may have not been directly involved in the violence and were now horrified at how the others had gotten a bit carried away. Whatever the reason, whilst around 30 people had originally descended on the homestead, it's estimated that only around 6 of them stuck around for the second leg. This reduced mob had decided on a different tactic this time. Instead of barging uninvited into the house, they preferred the idea of getting a bleary-eyed William to answer the door and taking him by surprise as they shot a load of bullets into him. I'm not sure where the shotgun suddenly came from, as there was no mention of the mob brandishing such weapons in the original attack on the homestead and no evidence of them being used there. It's possible they had them all along, but only decided to use them on phase 2 of the operation as they were a bit more scared of a potential counterattack from the notorious hardcase William. It's widely reported, but not confirmed, that the mob initially began to beat one of William's horses to death in the hope that the anguished cries of the animal would wake up the head of the household, but this tactic reportedly failed to raise anyone from their slumber. What we do know for sure is that one of the mob, alleged to be a member of the Ryder family, eventually just began shouting William's name from directly outside the house. Sure enough, the light flickered on and a male figure opened the door, only to be greeted by a hail of bullets. As the man fell to the ground, 2 members of the mob continued firing as many as 30 shots into the victim's chest and groin. William's wife, Nora, raced downstairs to the scene and made an attempt to shift the victim back indoors to safety, but the body was too heavy for her to drag. At this point, she was probably unaware that the small gang of attackers allegedly included her own brother. A second male figure later appeared at the doorway and successfully dragged the body back into the house. The gang departed the scene, apparently under the impression that they'd just killed William Donnelly. In fact, they'd failed in that mission. They'd certainly killed the man who had answered the door, but that man was John Donnelly, who had been staying overnight at Wayland's Corners. So, William must have been the second man who dragged the body back inside, right? That's definitely what I expect, yeah. Well, no, this was actually a friend of the family called Martin Hogan, who had also been staying overnight at the house. Whilst John Donnelly had been getting shot and Nora and Martin had been trying to get him back inside, albeit a tad late to do anything, William Donnelly had remained in the upstairs bedroom surveying the scene from a window. Oh god, he's gonna do some Taken on these guys. This could be considered an uncharacteristically cowardly moment for a man considered to be the most feared of all the Donnellys, especially as his wife had raced downstairs to potentially walk into a face full of bullets. But as he was known for his brains as well as his brawn, it could be the case that William had decided the shrewdest course of action would be to try and identify the attackers from a safe position. However, he reckoned he could only make out 3 of the faces. When the body of John Donnelly was later examined by a certain Dr. Flock, the doctor made the public observation he had so many shots in his body that he would have to be cut to mincemeat to get them all out. Dr. Flock's post-mortem reports on all 5 victims concluded that it was not possible to determine the exact causes of death as there were so little remains of the charred bodies. A later coroner's inquest, which was delayed until March, ruled that the victims had been murdered by persons unknown via methods of firearms, pitchfork, axe, shovel, clubs, and short wooden stakes. The usual suspects. Now, you might have expected the local and national press to take a fairly sympathetic stance towards the victims of a lynch mob, which went down in history as the Black Donnellys Massacre. And most of them did, whilst trying to take the time to express their revulsion at the senseless carnage that had taken place on their own doorstep. One national paper described the massacre as the blackest crime ever committed in the Dominion of Canada, while the Listowel paper pondered over a crime which has no parallel in the history of Canada. However, there were a couple of press reports who clearly felt the Donnellys had it coming. For example, the St. Mary Journal Argus appeared to consider it an event worth celebrating when they observed, quote, "The community is rid of most of a family who have made themselves a terror to the part of the country in which they resided. The Donnellys were desperadoes of the worst type, and their neighbours were afraid to witness against them, and no magistrate had backbone enough to convict them. While we regret exceedingly that such an atrocious murder was committed in our neighbourhood, the people of the township of Biddulph will breathe the freer." It's like, yeah, it's really bad that they were murdered, but everyone's better off. They deserved it. Meanwhile, the Globe managed to check out the word on the street. When they interviewed a man who preferred to remain anonymous, he told the reporter, "If you have lived here for the past 5 years, as I have done, you would know which side to sympathise with. The only friends the Donnellys have are a few persons who were in the ring with them and who are always ready to swear them out of anything." The man paused thoughtfully for a moment before adding, "Don't put my name in the paper, because if you do, I'll get another torch before 2 months. Wait, is he just threatening to, burn down the newspaper? Jesus Christ. I get the feeling that he was there stabbing pitchforks into people. But whilst the community weighed up whether they should be celebrating in the streets or recoiling in horror, the funeral for the 5 victims attracted a large turnout on February 6th, including, of course, Jim and Judith's surviving children, William, Patrick, Robert, and Jenny. William's going to get up to some right, surely. He's like the brainy, dangerous one, and his family have just been murdered. He's going to murder some people. Isn't that what's going to happen? I assume that's going to happen. At one point during the emotional sermon, Father Connolly broke down and wept, whilst emphasising that he bore no enmity against the family, a possible reaction to township mutterings that the priest had planted the seeds for the massacre with his so-called peace association and his anti-Protestant preachings, which had fueled further anger against the Blackfeet Donnellys and indirectly led to the forming of a splinter group with murder in mind. It's not his fault. He tried to start a peace group, and the people in the peace group were like, yeah, this, we're going to start the Vigilance group or whatever it was called, and murder. That's not the priest's fault. But the question remained over who, if anybody at all, was going to face justice for the 5 appalling murders. Didn't Danny say in the beginning that no one faces justice, which is kind of insane? While some people were trying to pin the blame on Father Connolly for his pesky meddling, I'm pretty sure the priest wasn't one of the people clutching a pitchfork on that night. In fact, it was generally believed that most people in the Biddulph township knew exactly who was responsible for the massacre, or at least they knew the identities of many people involved. This supposedly secret Vigilance committee wasn't really much of a secret at all at this stage, and most residents were aware that Constable James Carroll was the ringleader out for blood, supported by a list of particularly loyal acolytes who were known to keep his company and jump to his every command. It's alleged that despite the late hour of the lynching, several witnesses observed the mob first approaching the homestead and may have identified some of those familiar faces hidden beneath the women's clothing, but not one of them fancied the idea of testifying in court. So in terms of eyewitnesses, we're left with the sole testimony of a 13-year-old farmhand for the attack on the homestead, during which Johnny O'Connor claims to have recognized the faces and voices of the main perpetrators, and the sole testimony of William Donnelly for the attack on Wayland's Corners, during which he claimed to have recognized 3 faces in the darkness from his bedroom window. The notable lack of other eyewitnesses willing to stand up in court meant that securing a conviction was always going to be tricky, especially in a region where the juries were already known to be quite reluctant to give a guilty verdict, even if a man had been seen by 1,000 witnesses shooting a victim in the chest while screaming, "I've caught you bang to rights, governor!" Nevertheless, within just a couple of days, the police still eventually managed to round up a list of around 13 members of the Vigilance Committee based largely on the names provided by Johnny O'Connor and William Donnelly. Every name on the list, including Constable James Carroll, members of the Thompson, Kennedy, and Toohey families, were arrested and kept in jail before a series of preliminary hearings were held at McLean's Hotel in Lucan. It was ultimately decided that only Constable James Carroll would initially face trial for his alleged involvement in the specific murder of Judith Donnelly, as observed by Johnny O'Connor. Some of the other suspects were released on bail, but 5 of them were held in jail until their own trials would be supposedly set for later in the year, assuming the local courts could fit them into their remarkably busy schedule. It was the press who first began pondering whether it was entirely fair to hold a trial in a courthouse in London, Ontario, where it was believed that many of the deep feelings of prejudice held against the Donnellys, alongside strong waves of support for the suspects who may have got rid of a big chunk of the troublesome family. It was a point eventually picked up by the prosecution team, who petitioned the judge, Justice Armour, for a change in venue to more neutral grounds, but the request was denied. They're never going to get a fair trial. Everybody hates them. I mean, not them. Everyone hates the Donnellys. So the person on trial, this sheriff dude or whatever, he's definitely going to get away with this. Another concern was the immediate safety of young Johnny O'Connor. Bearing in mind that he was the sole witness of the first attack, it wasn't entirely inconceivable that someone working on the side of the suspects might attempt to take him out of the picture before he had a chance to testify. Oh my god, yes, of course. He's got to be in witness protection or whatever. Johnny's parents, Michael and Mary, had already been the targets of abuse when they were out and about on the streets of Biddulph, and one of their 2 properties was later burned down, although thankfully the property was empty at the time. The court ruled that the whole O'Connor family should be taken out of Biddulph and relocated in a safer area in London, which would be guarded at all times by a constable. At this point, though, Mary O'Connor appeared to start taking the piss. She insisted that the family didn't need 24-hour protection of a constable, and argued that those wages should instead be paid to Johnny's older brother, who would do just as good a job looking out for the family on his own. Surprisingly, the court accepted this request, but the arrangement lasted less than a week, as that's all the time it took for Johnny's responsible bodyguard to go and get arrested after a drunken brawl in a store. A little down the line, Mary O'Connor began demanding money for new furnishings or for the new pad in London, which she perceived as inadequately decorated, along with various other convoluted expenses that she'd managed to drum up during this difficult period. Again, the court seemed to agree to her every financial request. Okay, remarkably generous. But Crown Attorney Charles Hutchinson appeared to be losing his patience with Mary in a letter addressed to the Attorney General, in which he notes to the parents, "In my opinion, I regret to say they have but little thought except as to the amount of money they can make out of the situation." Carry on, Constable. The first trial of Constable James Carroll got underway in London on October 4th, 1880, and as you might already be able to deduce from the wording of that sentence, the outcome couldn't really be described as conclusive. There's not actually much surviving documentation from the original trial, although the word on the street is that we didn't really learn anything new over the course of the 6 days. The prosecution team, led by Emilius Irving, was still heavily reliant on testimony provided by Johnny O'Connor, which had been heard in detail during the coroner's inquest, and which formed the basis of my earlier description of the attack on the homestead. But one aspect that doesn't get reported very often is the surprising admission from Johnny O'Connor that he was spotted by Constable James Carroll during the massacre. The way the story is usually told, Johnny was never detected by the attackers, yet the boy claimed in court that Carol climbed the stairs, saw Johnny hiding under the bed, looked him straight in the eyes before leaving the bedroom without uttering a word. If true, this suggests that while the mob were happy to cover their tracks by murdering a 21-year-old niece who had nothing to do with their grievances, James Carroll couldn't quite bring himself to hurt a 13-year-old farmhand. He may have felt that this would have been crossing the line for a respectable constable. But murdering an innocent 21-year-old who was just on holiday for Ireland, that's cool. Christ. Slightly confusingly, the trial also had testimonies from William Donnelly and some of the suspects connected with the attack on Wayland's Corners, even though at this stage Carroll was the only one being charged for the specific murder of Judith Donnelly at a different property. The defense team, led by Hugh McMahon, also wheeled out a long list of alibis who all insisted that each suspect had spent the night in question indoors. Some of them had been enjoying a drink, some of them had been playing cards, and some of them had been chatting about the futility of human existence in an infinite cosmos, but absolutely none of them had been wandering around in the middle of the night with pitchforks and shovels, and that is absolutely a fact. After the prosecution and defense wrapped up their arguments, Justice Armour appeared to be steering the jury in the direction of a guilty verdict against Carroll. But after just 5 hours of deliberations, the jury declared there was no hope of reaching a verdict. 7 were in favour of acquittal, 4 were in favour of conviction, and 1 couldn't make up his mind. Wait, doesn't that mean you get acquitted? Isn't it like they have to get all of them? No? Or like 10 out of 12 or something like that? Oh, this is Canada. I don't know how it works in Canada. I don't really know how it works anywhere. One juror in favour of acquittal later noted that he couldn't bring himself to convict James Carroll solely on the word of a 13-year-old boy, whilst another made the rather troubling admission that he wouldn't have voted in favour of conviction even if he had witnessed Carroll carrying out the murders with his own eyes. Dude, you need to be dismissed from the jury pool. Like, what the f***? What are you doing in there? It's like, nah, even if he was guilty, I'd say he wasn't. I love him. He's my mate. The second and final trial of Constable James Carroll was scheduled for January 1881, this time presided over by Justice Cameron. Concerns were raised before the trial even got underway when it was noted that the jury was entirely made up of Protestants in a case involving the alleged murder of a Blackfeet family by an Irish Catholic. Yeah, again, you need to dismiss this jury and find some people who are actually impartial. Some suggested this wasn't entirely fair on Constable James Carroll. It's not fair on him. Like, even though he did this it's not fair on him. He needs an impartial jury. Yet Crown Attorney Charles Hutchinson felt that the odds were still very much stacked against a conviction, as there was so much hatred for the Donnellys still festering in the region. At one point, he wrote a weary letter to prosecutor Amelia Serving, in which he complained that it was just a waste of time and money pushing on with a second trial as the outcome was inevitable. But the prosecution pushed on ahead regardless. Yeah, I mean, it's a good try by the defense. It's like, you might as well give up because everyone hates the family, and this guy's, even if he killed them, they're going to let him off. And the prosecution is like, yeah, you're right, let's just go chill. One notable difference this time around is that the testimonies were devoted almost exclusively to the attack on the homestead, and William Donnelly was not invited to speak about the murder of his brother at Wayland's Corners. I have to admit that I had trouble getting my head around the logic of spending so much of the first trial discussing the second attack when it appears to bear little direct relation to the murder of Judith Donnelly at the hands of Constable James Carroll. It was now decided that the incident at Wayland's Corners would be scrutinised during potential future trials of suspects charged specifically with the second attack. Yeah, which makes way more sense. The second attack has nothing to do with the first, or nothing to do with what's going on in court. The main alibi for James Carroll was farmer William Thompson Jr. of the missing cow fame. Thompson testified in court that Carroll had slept at his house on the night in question, and they'd both retired to bed at around 10 p.m. However, it's worth noting, William Thompson Jr. himself was suspected of being a member of the mob, as his testimony conflicted somewhat with the statement he gave to police the morning after the massacre, in which he claimed to have gone to bed alone at around 6:30 and not waking up again until 7 a.m. the following morning. That's a very long sleep, which seems like a remarkably long snooze for a farmer. Yeah, he slept 12 and a half hours. No one sleeps 12 and a half hours. When challenged about this in court, William Thompson Jr. claimed that he didn't recall saying that in the police statement, but he may have panicked and lied out of fear of being wrongfully arrested. Johnny O'Connor was given a tough grilling by the defense team, during which there were some minor discrepancies uncovered in the various statements he'd given along the way, involving specific noises that he'd heard and weapons that he'd glimpsed. There was also doubt cast over why exactly the valance of Jim and Judith's bed would have been removed, providing Johnny with the only opportunity to peek at the carnage from his hiding position, but Johnny swore that this was true. In fact, Johnny did a remarkably good job of remaining calm, composed, measured, and respectful throughout the trial, even when his earlier recollections to the prosecution were continually interrupted by objections from the defense, which were usually upheld by Justice Cameron, who clearly wasn't taking a very favorable view of the boy's testimony. If Johnny was calm and composed, his mother Mary was sadly the exact opposite. Throughout her questioning by the defense team, she was defensive, tetchy, and downright hostile at times. Here's an example of a typical exchange between Mary O'Connor, defense lawyer Hugh McMahon, and Justice Cameron regarding a question involving how much money she was trying to make from all of this. Mary, I don't want to be speaking to the jury or anyone else. What for do you be forcing a woman to answer against her will? Oh my God, people spoke weird in the past. Hugh McMahon, you'll have to answer my question, Mrs. O'Connor. If you don't, you'll be made to. Mary, you may keep me here for a month then. Cameron, I'll commit you, Mrs. O'Connor, unless you answer the question. Mary, you can send me to prison if you like. Cameron, I will, unless you answer the question. Mary, well then, send me. It's nice to work trying to get a woman to speak against her will. Mary O'Connor didn't get sent to prison, but the problem is her unique contribution to the proceedings very probably did more harm than good to the prosecution. It was revealed that she'd been constantly squeezing money from the Crown for ridiculous reasons and had been contemplating how to get her hands on a $4,000 reward put up by the government of Ontario for information leading to a conviction. That's a hell of a lot of money. This led to speculation that Johnny O'Connor had been providing testimony under guidance from his money-grabbing mother. An allegation which had been dismissed by Justice Armour during the first trial, but one which Justice Cameron felt was quite probable. In fact, a week later, Justice Cameron informed the jury that Johnny O'Connor's testimony should be considered unreliable, leaving the jury with little else to work with. On February 2nd, 1881, a unanimous verdict of not guilty was declared in the case of Constable James Carroll. Am I surprised by this? In no way whatsoever. Do I think he's guilty? Hell yes! Do I think he's going to get guilty? No, never did. As soon as the verdict was declared, whoops of joy and delight briefly echoed all through the courthouse, although these quickly subsided when Judge Cameron announced that anyone caught applauding would be immediately arrested. Yeah, it's not appropriate to clap in a courtroom. And whilst Cameron appeared to have directed the jury to the verdict, he did have a little sympathy for the acquitted defendant. In his closing remarks to Carroll, he noted, "You, James Carroll, are a number of the constabulary of your own county, and you have, in the discharge of your duties as constable, exhibited the utmost asperity." What does this mean? Oh, what happened to my dictionary? I normally have a dictionary where I can look stuff up. Because I'm small-brained. Oh, well, this is like an old word from the past, right? It has been plainly shown that you are particularly anxious to prosecute the Donnellys, and if you have suffered a year's imprisonment, you have yourself to blame for it. This, together with the continual dread and uncertainty hanging over you, for you have had what may be looked upon as a narrow escape for your life, may be regarded by you in some measure as punishment for your dereliction of duty in the discharge of your duties as constable. I trust you will leave the dock a better and wiser man. Even judges back in the day, it's like, what are you saying? Basically, like, you've been a very naughty boy and it's lucky you got off. Perhaps a guilty verdict was always going to be unlikely in a trial held in a region where the Donnellys were hated by so many, especially considering the potential consequences for other suspects who could consequently be put on trial in the event of a conviction for Carroll. Before the verdict was reached, one of the jurors had apparently asked prosecutor Amelia Serving if there was any chance at all that Carroll might not be hanged if he was found guilty, to which the prosecutor had simply replied no. This may have influenced the jury to some degree, as they now feared that a guilty verdict in this case would ultimately result in the hanging of a long list of other husbands and fathers in the Biddulph township. Yeah, it does set a dangerous precedent for all of those people. This trial is super biased. It's also a great pity that the testimony of the sole witness to the first attack on the homestead was disregarded as unreliable. Maybe a constable was never going to be hung on the word of a 13-year-old farmhand, and whilst Johnny O'Connor was always remarkably mature and composed throughout the trials, it's not out of the question that he may have been recalling certain events that he never actually witnessed, or that he may have been influenced by his mother, who had a beady eye on a nice new mahogany piano for the front room. But the facts still remain that shortly after arch-enemy Constable James Carroll formed a Vigilance committee with a ruthless agenda of solving the Donnelly problem for good, 5 members of the family were massacred by a lynch mob. I suppose it could have just been a huge coincidence. Yeah, it's not. Of course it's not. We all know they did it. It's nice about these things being so far in the past, because you don't have to be like, allegedly, because everyone is dead for centuries. Like, they did it. We know they did it. A big group of them, led by this constable dude, went and murdered a whole bunch of people, and they got away with it. But here's where things get a little bit baffling. In light of the verdict, all the other prisoners were granted bail and nobody else was ever brought to trial for the murders. I don't think that's baffling. It's like, if the ringleader got off on not guilty, then all of the others are as well. It's going to be a waste. It's like a class action lawsuit, right? They get a class together, and then they go to court, and if it gets struck down, then they don't go for each individual plaintiff until they get what they want. And here it's going to be the same result, because it's the same witnesses and the same situation, and they're just not going to be guilty. The reasoning seemed to be that as it had not been possible to secure a conviction in the case of Constable James Carroll, it would be a waste of time and resources even attempting to secure a conviction for any of the other suspects. Exactly. I can see why this makes some sort of sense for the attack on the homestead, in which the prosecution would again need to rely on the same sole testimony that had already been deemed unreliable. Oh yeah, but there's the attack on the second house. Why? That should be tried separately. But I'm surprised that this also seemed to apply to the second attack at Wayland's Corners, which was arguably an entirely separate event with entirely different witnesses, only one of which, William Donnelly, claimed to have identified some of the perpetrators. It might even be argued that the separate events were different operations, which involved at least some different suspects. It's generally assumed that following the Homestead attack, the same mob moved on to Wayland's Corners in a greatly reduced number, and this is backed up by the amount of time that elapsed between the two events, and the fact that a few of the same faces were supposedly identified by both Johnny O'Connor and William Donnelly. But it does seem odd that the two mobs employed such different strategies and were armed with such different weapons. Whilst the first mob confidently barged into the homestead with pitchforks and shovels, the second, much smaller mob were armed with shotguns and just fired bullets at their target in a doorway from a distance before legging it. It almost feels as if the two incidents were masterminded by entirely different suspects, or it could be that the mob were far more scared of William Donnelly than they were the rest of his family, which might explain why most of them went back home for supper after the first attack, and why the remainder of the group stopped off to collect shotguns. Yeah, although if you're in that first group, if everyone goes home, then you're all f***ed, because William Donnelly's going to be like, get my gun. Although, is he going to get revenge on all of these people? I get the feeling he's not, right? Because I feel like Danny told us some details of the story at the beginning. I'd kind of expect William Donnelly to be like, all right, let's go. William Donnelly claimed in his testimony during the first trial that he definitely saw the faces of 3 attackers from his bedroom window, including Constable James Carroll and his own brother-in-law, John Kennedy. He also claimed that he thought he could identify 3 others, but he couldn't quite be as sure about those. The Crown presumably felt that further trials could not go ahead based on the sole testimony of a witness who was peering out into the inky gloom. The matter was dropped, and nobody was ever convicted of participating in the Black Donnellys massacre. A conspiracy of silence. In the immediate aftermath of the verdict, the released prisoners headed straight down to the Western Hotel for a celebratory drink. One newspaper reported that William Donnelly briefly popped into the very same bar and extended a surprising invitation to buy a drink for all the suspects. What are you doing? It wasn't really the most cordial of invitations, though. The exact words he barked out were, "I want all you murderers to come and have something." Nobody accepted the generous invitation, and William left the Western Hotel shortly afterward without further incidents. All those dudes, I'd just be like with one eye open in the night looking for William Donnelly in the shadows of my bedroom. The press in general bravely swam against the anti-Donnelly tide, as the majority of the papers appeared to conclude that justice had most definitely not been served. One paper described Constable James Carroll and his cohorts as a bunch of sinister, envious, dangerous backwoodsmen, whilst the Toronto Globe noted of the trial, stronger evidence has rarely been brought against any man who in the face of it escaped the gallows. It did briefly appear as if those sinister, envious, dangerous backwoodsmen might yet face another trial when just a month later, 2 of the suspects, brothers James and William Fahili, apparently made a shocking confession to Patrick Donnelly that they had indeed been members of the mob and everything Johnny O'Connor had claimed in court had been absolutely true. Don't talk about your crimes. Don't talk about your crimes, especially to a member of the family who you committed those crimes against. What are you doing? The Fahili family had always been considered good friends of the Donnellys, and you may remember that James Fahili was the sneaky two-faced bag who was working as a spy for the Vigilance Committee. Oh, I didn't remember that, but that's the dude, okay. Whilst popping around to the homestead and cheerfully eating all of their biscuits. Well, it seems as if the sneaky two-faced shitbag was on the verge of making amends for all of his behaviour after he claimed to Patrick Donnelly that he and his brother never wanted to get involved in the first place, but they'd done so out of fear of repercussions from the Vigilance Committee. The brothers also apparently revealed that they had no idea that the 5 victims were to be murdered, they just thought they were going to be a little roughed up. The bad news is that shortly after making this confession, the Fahili brothers fled to Michigan to avoid having to testify against the Vigilance Committee. The good news is that by the end of the year, the brothers have been extradited back to Canada to face questioning. But the other bad news is that they denied ever having made such a confession and refused to testify, meaning that the whole matter was again quietly dropped. What did they think was going to happen? That they're going to come back and be like, because they're not, like, what, are you going to testify against themselves? Like, what? What? Either Patrick Donnelly had just made the whole thing up, or the Fahili brothers were really utterly terrified of the Vigilance Committee. The 5 victims were laid to rest underneath a large monument erected in St. Patrick's Cemetery in the Biddulph Township. The inscriptions were unusually dramatic for a commemorative monument. The full name of each victim was bluntly accompanied with the word "murdered!" The monument was reportedly the target of vandalism during the early years, but it remained in place until 1964, by which point renewed interest in the Donnelly massacre had generated such a spike in visitors to the controversial monument that public access to the cemetery was temporarily denied. The monument was replaced with a much smaller grave marker, which notably omitted the 5 striking uses of the word "murdered." It's often reported that this decision was taken by then priest of St. Patrick's Church, but it would appear that the descendants of the Donnellys fully approved of the replacement. For at least 7 decades, the original monument was the only stark reminder of the massacre in both the Biddulph Township and the nearby village of Lucan, where the story was heavily suppressed. Despite the fact that the story was well known throughout the rest of North America, many children in the local area grew up without having the faintest clue about the Donnellys because it was considered taboo to discuss the subject. Of course it was, because they all, like I said at the beginning, this whole group of people got away with murder. Of course they're not talking about it. They shut the up. Those 2 guys talked about it. They're idiots. Everyone else is like, just don't talk about the murders that we all were in on, okay? We got away with it. Don't talk about it ever again. Shut the up. Good work. Good criminals. The reason behind this reluctance to share the past is apparently because nobody wanted to upset the descendants of the suspects who lived in the township. If the citizens were really that bothered about hiding away from history, you'd think they might have got rid of the monument a fair bit sooner, bearing in mind that it defiantly screamed murder from the grounds of St. Patrick's Cemetery, but I guess that the kids were supposed to just ignore that and not ask any awkward questions. The conspiratorial cloud of covert concealment finally began to clear a little in 1954 when crime author Thomas Kelly wrote the best-selling book The Black Donnellys, which sparked fresh interest in the massacre and was largely responsible for driving all those new visitors to the monument. It has to be said that Thomas Kelly was also a fantasy writer, and many have questioned his take on events, which seems to paint the whole family as black-hearted monsters who thoroughly deserved their grisly fate. A more sympathetic view has been adopted in recent years by the citizens of the now merged township of Lucan-Biddulph, which is today home to the Lucan Area Heritage and Donnelly Museum. Alongside the display of local historical artifacts from the last 150 years, probably not including the logging handspike that killed Patrick Farrell, the museum also hosts a mock-up of the original Donnellys homestead, in which visitors can experience a spine-chilling account of the whole saga. It's pretty grim. What's this? Oh yeah, this is like 100 years in the future or whatever. What's this? Well, this is the room where who was the guy who cut the faces off people? Anyway, it was a strange relationship with his mother. God damn, he's super famous. What's his name? That dude. A mock-up of his like weird murder house. I don't know if that's appropriate for a museum. In fact, much to the chagrin of older residents, Lucan-Biddulph has begun to develop something of a small tourist industry based around the Donnellys. It saddens me to say that you can even fork out for ghost tours, which play on the ideas that apparitions of the victims are regularly spotted in the window of the original homestead, and that horses refuse to pass the homestead on the night of February the 3rd. Of course, they're just people making some money. But even though there are some entrepreneurial souls and paranormal charlatans now willing to cash in on the carnage, there are residents of Lucan-Biddulph who still consider the whole topic to be off limits even today. A final intervention by God. Did the fantasy writer Thomas Kelly have a point when he suggested that the Donnellys deserved everything that was coming to them? Well, I think it's pretty hard to justify breaking into somebody's house and bludgeoning the occupants to death under any circumstances, particularly when the murder of the visiting 21-year-old niece Bridget was carried out purely to get rid of witnesses. It's safe to conclude that the Donnellys were no angels. They fiercely fought their corner, usually with their fists. They were regularly involved in bar brawls, and they had no qualms about seriously pissing off the community to make a point. It's probable that there were times when when they seriously crossed the boundaries. One of the many disturbing incidents was, of course, the death of Patrick Farrell, although it's difficult to know for sure whether this was an act of callous murder or an accidental result of instinctive self-defense during the throes of battle. There were other alleged atrocities over the years, particularly during the height of the Stagecoach feud, but as the Donnellys were copping the blame for absolutely everything by that point, usually without conviction from the half-hearted courts, it's impossible to ascertain when they were guilty or innocent. If I was a gambling man, I'd wager that they were guilty of quite a few of the horrendous crimes that they were accused of committing, but I'm still not going to argue against the principle of innocent until proven guilty. But it's an interesting point to ponder. When I first began researching this saga, I was deeply curious as to how William Donnelly would exact his dastardly revenge on the men that murdered his family. Yes! After all, he's gonna go all taken on them. After all, this was the formidable leader of the pack whose family had just been savagely murdered by a group of around 30 men who had escaped justice. I figured he would take the law into his own hands and hunt all of them down one by one until he had felt justice had been served. If nothing else, it would have made for a gripping movie franchise. But he did no such thing. He was actually urged to move out of the area in a short letter from Crown Attorney Charles Hutchinson, who quite insensitively pointed out, "It seems to me that you are incurring no little risk in remaining there, without much chance of doing good." William stayed put, and even became a constable himself for a few years, although I'm now starting to think that every man in Biddulph Township became a constable at some point, and he always felt sure that justice would be served in the end, although his faith in the justice system appears to have been misplaced. He told the Morning News in 1884, quote, "There were too many in that conspiracy to keep it quiet always. I can afford to wait. I've waited 4 years now, and I can wait 20 more. But it's still a little surprising that William Donnelly never once resorted to dishing out his own retribution. Could it be that he was getting too old for all of that malarkey? Or could it be that he was a changed man who had seen the light? Or could it be that he was never really the psychotic nutcase villain that everyone made him out to be? Ooh, that's compelling, isn't it? Maybe he's just not, the only reason we think of him as a psycho is because we're getting this, crazy one-sided view of the Donnellys, which we tried to not be crazy one-sided about. So it's entirely possible he's just not a nutter like we thought he was. That's not to say the surviving Donnellys didn't entirely avoid drama and controversy over the next few years. It was reported in the papers in 1881 that William and Robert Donnelly had both been caught red-handed attempting to set fire to a mill belonging to one William Stanley, but later court documents show that they hadn't been caught in the act at all, and both defendants were found not guilty. The Salvation Army arrived in town in 1885, and Robert Donnelly was one of many residents who vocally disapproved of their presence and the unholy racket that they made as they marched up and down the streets, banging their drums and tambourines. Well, yeah, that does sound rather annoying, doesn't it? When the Salvation Army's barracks were mysteriously burned down in the middle of the night... Get the f*** out of here. Robert Donnelly was the prime candidate for lighting the match, but it was never even proven that the incident was an act of deliberate arson. Probably was, though. Those banging the drums up and down the street sound really annoying. What does the Salvation Army even do? At some point in the 1880s, Robert Donnelly experienced a problem with missing geese. Determined to catch the culprit, he stayed up all night and witnessed an intruder approaching his flock who was identified as Constable Hugh McKay. It's another constable. Robert decided to teach the constable a lesson by beating him senseless. It sounds like it starts off so early. He decided to teach him a lesson by beating the living out of him. And strangely enough, the only one to get arrested was Constable Hugh McKay, who was charged with larceny. The constable who made that arrest was a certain Constable William Donnelly. But on the whole, the Donnellys lived out the rest of their lives in relative peace, and all 4 surviving members of the family died of natural causes without a gunshot to be heard. Jenny was the last one to pass away in 1916. The same can't be said for many of the original suspects who were destined to face a chain of quite ghastly deaths. Oh, maybe William was getting them from behind the, just secretly offing them and making it look like an accident. This doesn't include the ringleader, Constable James Carroll, although he was eventually sacked from his post for misconduct and moved to the Rocky Mountains, where he reportedly spent the remainder of his life penniless and alone. Oh no. But many of the others were hit by trains, gored to death by bulls, found dead in haunted wells, or died from incredibly painful diseases. It was not a point lost on William Donnelly, who appeared to give all the credit to God. In a letter published in the Exeter Times in 1883, he wrote, "In 13 years since the murders, 34 persons, directly or indirectly concerned in that slaughter, have met their just deserts, and none of them have been murdered. A direct visitation from mighty God must have been the cause. If the next 13 years will reap a larger harvest as the last 13, I think justice will have been done." I'm not sure if death by direct visitation from Almighty God would have made it onto any of the death certificates, though. No, but it is he's probably pleased. He's like, yes, you fell in that haunted well, didn't you? Definitely didn't I don't think he pushed him. Whoever fell in the haunted well. But it's nice. It's nice for him. Speaking of God, it's often said that religion was the root cause of the 40-year feud, which resulted in the Black Donnellys Massacre. The story is widely painted in a way which suggests that the Donnellys tried to escape the religious conflicts in Ireland, only to find the religious conflicts followed them all the way to Canada and ultimately to their graves. But I don't think that's the case at all. Yes, I'm sure there were some Irish Catholics on the Roman line who disapproved of the Donnellys associating with Protestants, but this seems to be more of a story about feuding neighbours just getting right up each other's noses. Yeah, I agree. I think that's exactly it. The resentment kicked off with the disagreements over land rather than disagreements over the Pope. Many of the new neighbours in Canada would have taken an instant dislike to the Donnellys after they built up a prosperous new farm on land which was perceived to be stolen. The murder of Patrick Farrell didn't exactly help matters, whilst the situation only intensified when the family started up their own stagecoach line, which sparked a whole new era of cutthroat business rivalry. Perhaps this is less a story about religious conflict and more a story of a long-running feud between grumpy neighbours in a wild and almost lawless small town in which nearly everyone seemed to be both a constable and a criminal. A nasty feud which spiralled out of control and led to the forming of a lynch mob by one particular constable with a pitchfork to grind. As wisely pointed out in the London Free Press by Thomas Levesque, supervisor at the Lucan Area Heritage Museum and Donnelly Museum, quote, "One of the most important things to remember from something like this is how fallible humans can be and how easy it is for us to stoke each other up with fears." Thank goodness we've all moved on from that kind of nonsense in today's more enlightened age, except we haven't. And that's where we end today's rather lengthy episode. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed it. It's Friday afternoon for me, so I'm going to go and enjoy my weekend. I have no idea when you'll be hearing this, but hopefully I'll have a good weekend. And I'll see you next time.